Hello! Today, syncopation, the drive of romantic era. Schumann, Beethoven before. They were living through the expression of their soulful humanity expressed in the music by this anxiety of the anticipated or delayed beat of the beat compared to a downbeat. And in Schumann he took care of the downbeat and it became its own offbeat beat. So this incredible shift of this anxiety-driven excitement or desperate hope or hope beyond desperation is the expression of the displayed pulse and harmony as well. It's not all about rhythm. Well, it is, but it is a passionate language of expressing with anticipations or delays your emotional state. That was specific to the Romantic era in Europe, where the emotions had to be written in novels, depicted in operas. In fact, to us, or to rational us of today, of perhaps, but of course with exceptions, this kind of driven passion, involvement in idealism. Schumann wrote a magazine that he created about new writing of music, rethinking art in its different forms, written, painted, and all, and how it implements the progress of humanity, the brotherhood between people, not just the endless, over centuries known greed and possession and wars, but art as a form of elevation of the spirit, which was factually the religion, or in plural, shall I say, religions. And then little by little, that was in Western Europe to evaporate and replaced by ambitions of idealizations that became patterns of thinking, indoctrinizations, organizations of the few to the many in order to organize a better world, or a world that is better to them. Of course, you cannot take out of the human nature the desire of possession, the desire of ownership, and the desire to mark their passage on earth as if they are immortals by the power of their wealth or their fame. And nothing is more passing than these things. So to go back out of this philosophical, historical, social digression, and God forbids I'm digressing a lot. I purposely don't take examples of existing pieces, though look-alikeness with many is obvious, but already Mozart in français, Mozart. Or Mozart, or in the D minor concerto. Is breathless, is unsettled, is all what Schumann is constantly in the third movement of the concerto. But you don't have? You avoid the downbeats that in fact display, explaining in subtext that this is a harmony of or rhythmicity of harmony of a syncopation overlapping the downbeat of the next bar, creating a tension for a release, which then gets connected to the next tension in your basically hopping from one tension to the next. And Beethoven starts liberating himself from the downbeats in the 101. And only the score reader knows that is before the beat. If not, he would have been one hand on the beat. He does that in the third sonata for cello. I believe because the syncopation was an expression of anticipation, of excitement, of impatience. You want to be on the note before the note, and when you become on the note downbeat, you're already tight. So you hear the harmony downbeat, and it gives you a sense of projection, anticipation, expectation, and delayed resolution that becomes its own next tension. And you have these chain systems of 2x2 subphrases lament in Baroque, and in Chopin's same key F minor fourth ballade. These chains of chain series rather of appoggiaturas, leaning notes, appoggiare, becoming the resolution at the moment where you change the harmony and becoming the next tension. That's the squares of the F minor opus 34 Brahms quintet. So whether you do the syncopation as a bridge overlapping the pulse harmonization and melodization on the downbeats, and liberates you to flow over in overarching groups of bars and becoming so incredibly free, barless, finally, away from the form, the group of 4 bars, subsections that have to be organized. You free yourself from a doctrine, but also you allow yourself to live this intensity of the melodically, what it can be called, and I call it very often, so I don't know if others do, run-on sentence, instead of organized group of notes, bars, notes, words. It's all about an intensity that goes on for a very long time, overlapping the bars, which are very regular in the notation. But when you listen to the music, thankfully you don't hear a bar line, the opening of the Schumann Fantasy. It's always not finished. It's a little further, a little further, a little more absolute love, absolute passion, absolute desire, all or nothing, no compromise, no synthesization of factors, not synchronization, not equals, but one prevailing over the other by love, passion, or possession. It was an era of incredible expression of human passions and emotions without any or attempting, like the Liszt sonata, like the Schumann sonatas, like the Chopin sonatas to a lesser extent, but still they do, the freedom of the human soul to express themselves fully and unadulterated expression. It's a very important factor. The syncopation contributed to that. I think in the 19th century, chromatization was already an effect of emotional tension and release and anxiety and expectation. For the 18th century, the chromatic scale, color in Greek, semitones everywhere, darkening the diatonic tonalities. I think the syncopations became the expression of the inner mood, inner world. It wasn't something you exposed like the notes, chromatic or not. If you do, or you do, but if you do, you enter in another dimension to the syncopation of the storytelling. Partly the German context of the literature, and of course their spoken language of all these Middle European composers, mostly German, if not by German education. In the Romantic era, they all read Goethe, and they all loved the mythology of all these German situations of the past. And in the syntax, the verb is at the end. To whom I go, but you don't know until you hear the verb. If you did, you go or you will. To whom I went. And so if you make a long sentence and the verb is at the very end, it creates a sense of expectation, tensions. In that tension creates a sense of excitement and anxiety at the same time. Will he love me? Will she not love me? Will I be chosen? If not, how will I live without the love of my life? And all of a sudden, these expressions that were in theater plays and novels entered in the expression of the non-lyrics music, just pure music of notes, which by their melodic lips, with the melodic six, expresses the mood of hope and will, but with an emotional humanity, because it's major or minor, the G minor quintet by Mozart. Excuse me, but that even for the late 18th century, because he died in 1791. So he uses the ascending six for twice, repeating the hope of the emotion, and then the scream of despair of the minor ninth. And here it's not syncopated, it's not separated by a suspension or even an appoggiatura. It's just a scream of the minor ninth. And in the development, they speak to me when they write these transitions. Mozart is probably the king of the greatest transitions. Oh my God, the transitions in Mozart, I think they're more beautiful than his themes, and God forbid he has the greatest melodic input. Perhaps the output like Tchaikovsky, perhaps like for sure Bellini, all these great Chopin melodists, but he has the way to do a transition that gives me bumps on the skin. I mean, it makes me shiver. There isn't a cheap moment in Mozart's music. It can be vain in the character, it can be just because he knows how to write also music for little small talk. How are you today? Yes. Did you enjoy the weather yesterday? Yes. And he knows how well to write these nothings as well as the very things. And I think the Beethovens, later the Schumanns and Schuberts especially, they picked up from him so much for that, but went further in. I mean, imagine if Mozart died at 70 instead of 35. Gosh, he would have died with Chopin. Oh my God, this is scary to think. Or Schubert. Or all those who died in their mid-30s and already explored intensely a lot of things, wrote feverishly, literally feverishly, music, not always commissioned, most of the time none for Schubert in terms of commissions, but always by a desire to express something, a need. Is it rational? Is it? No, obviously not for him. Is it rational for anybody? Is it less expressive when Haydn does it by obligation and he still cranks amazing symphonies while so many? In other words, the industrial quantity for the survival that is necessary at the time when music was consumed and therefore ephemeral, compared to today, recorded, studied, learned, performed, compared in the interpretations, let less before when they just gathered to read, and that was it for the interpretation. It was a different time. But I find that when we play that time, being in our time, we are in the present of their past while we live in our present. It's kind of awkward to say, but it's exactly how I think. It's not a museum artifact. It's not like reading an ancient script in some dead language. I think the language is incredibly alive. And sometimes when you have text with music, the text is beautiful as they are. Sometimes they age because the language has evolved. But the music, for the most of the time, for the last 3 centuries of classical music, you cannot say that because the modernity or the audacity of a composer comes, let's say, Ravel after Schubert, then Schubert is irrelevant. Or Schubert is more beautiful because he writes more beautiful than Haydn, and Haydn greater than Bach, and Bach better than Frescobaldi, and Frescobaldi better than von Bingen, and so on, blah, blah, blah. No, of course not. Nobody believes that. Except people who do competitions in art. That's why I think they're not fair. You're number 1, you're number 2, you're number 3. And the hierarchy is now we have the great composers and the less known and the forgotten ones. Of course, because there's so many who had to live and survive that we don't, the common culture of the people has kept a few in mind. Thankfully, they're great. And we serve them constantly, the Beethovens and all that. But the syncopation is what drove them to express themselves soulfully. It allowed them to express both combinations of anticipation, anxiety, hope, and fear of hoping. The ambiguity, the exposure of the human ambivalence of the nature of human being, monster or angel, the same at the same time. The passion can drive you to become irrational for every reason. And that is what fascinates people who try to be rational. Now they can channel it, as I said, through the religion, or then let it go full throttle, so to say, through the uncharted, unstoppable passions. But ultimately, the syncopation in classical music, especially when it's not based on a downbeat that proves it, it's a syncopation that makes you make believe that that's what you want it to be. Is it real, daydream, or reality of the action? You don't know. And you don't know until the end of the section. In fact, the downbeat is always rebouncing rather than, of course, except the last one if you finish on the downbeat, which is settling. All the others are unsettled. Or in the slow movement. In fact, the tempo only makes the syncopation apparently milder, but then more stretched, therefore more bridged, more arched, more in expectation of the resolution. In the fast tempi is an anxiety-driven expectation of emotional but this is not syncopation, it's just accentuation of the upper beat or the downbeat. So the way you express the accent on the syllable of the word gives it an assertiveness or not. And when you combine that with the syncopation, then your texture becomes alive in the sense of it's worth living this emotion once in our life, as we say when something great happens to us, or we assume out of the ordinary. Perhaps I over-idealize the romantic era through the music by saying every day of their life is out of the ordinary. And perhaps they were very ordinary in their everyday life too, in their own way, with the rules of their society that are very rigid and sexist and everything. I agree that that's partly something that I try to ignore, but it's there. At least because I don't deal with them as humans of their life. I'm interested to know how they were because I study music, because I love music, so I want to know about musicians. But ultimately, I want to know more about what I understand from the piece. The syncopations, the anticipations, the interruptions, and Mozart in the 4-1 quartet. Syncopation is 2 against 3 with the triplets plus the secondary voice over the tertiary voice and main voice. There you go, syncopation, anticipation. Luminous. It goes in you like an arrow of emotion and strive, and at the same time you feel like you're energized because you feel like, God, I'm living. Meaning, of course, I'm living because biologically I'm alive, and that's marvelous. It's not to be taken for granted. But at the same time, when you live something, when you accomplish something passionate, it doesn't have to be negative like most of the novels of today idealize people who do bad. Okay, it's easy moralization. I'm not here to moralize. I'm just saying that anybody who is driven at some point lives a little bit more intensively their life, regardless of what they're told by the psychiatrist and the psychanalyst, and everybody takes a pill to sleep and to wake up and this and to that. Not everybody, but many. And we'd have to cope with the stress of life and the hardness of life, and earning the money and never ever having enough, and worrying not to have at the end of this and that, and owning this to this and owing this to the others, and people depend on you, elders or youngers. Of course, I totally know. I live this life. I know that. I don't ignore it. But while I am in their musical world, even if they had their own daily lives, I connect with the emotions that meant to them so much to transmit. No electricity, no computer, nothing. Not even a medicine when they were getting a wound to not die from infection. So, yeah, Scriabin was certainly an illuminator for that. Woohoo! Rachmaninoff was incredibly emotional, though more rational in comparison. There's nothing to say compared to Scriabin, who can argue. Schumann, Mendelssohn, Chopin, Brahms. Well, they're not same generation, but late, early Brahms. You cannot say late, early Mozart. Yes, Schubert, Weber, Mendelssohn. They were right away ripe and young at the same time. I'm a very passionately driven person about understanding, if not living fully, all the innuendos and intentions to the notation that the intent of these composers gave us, that brings alive our strong emotions of life. It's amazing how few signs of paper from centuries away come alive and ignite in us the passion, emotion, excitement, anxiety, hope, drive, jubilation, despair, and nostalgia. And it's hinted by an interval, a chord, an intonation, possibly syncopation, or all of the above. Thank you.